Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel where we learn to be a better programmer. And in this video, we're going to talk about functions. But before we get started, be sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on post notifications so you don't miss out on the future parts of this video tutorial. All right. So what are functions? So functions are how we take an input. So we take an input and then do something. So let's say do something to that input, and then we return an output. So a function is just a way we transform information or execute some functionality inside of a class in Java. So I've created a package called functions, and inside of functions I've created a class called functions. This is kind of the pattern that we've been following the past few videos, so I wanted to continue that on. So, okay, so a function is similar to a variable in that it has access modifiers, it has non-access modifiers, and so on. But if variables represent the attributes of a class, then a function represents the actions that that class performs. So for example, if I have a class called humans, and a human is going to have like a name, height, weight, or whatever. So those are your attributes, but humans also have actions that they perform. So speak, walk, run, sleep, all those things are actions, and those verbs are treated as your methods or your functions to that class. So when we talk about functions, I said that there are access modifiers. So the access modifiers are private, public, and protected. And then the non-access modifiers are static, Yeah. And so when we want to define a new method, we go access modifier, like this. Then we do non-access modifier. And then we follow the return type, and then the name, followed by parentheses with some arguments. Close the parentheses, and then that's followed by some scope. Okay, so let's just see what this looks like. So if I say, we've seen what a method looks like in the main method. So if I write the main method out, we see that it's public. So it's public to anyone. It's static, meaning that it can be accessed. It's a class. It's a class function. So you don't need to instantiate functions to call this method. It doesn't return anything because that's the return type. Then there's the main, and then there's inside of the parentheses are our arguments. So the arguments are optional. So if we were to create a function called public void no arguments, and then we just have the open and closed parentheses followed by some scoping, and I can say system.out.println. This method takes no arguments. Okay, so in the previous video we talked about operators, and then we also talked about variables and stuff like that. So if we were to pass in something into a function, so say we wanted to create a function that added two numbers together. So we could say public, and what we want to return, let's say we want to add two integers together. So we'd say public integer, then add ints is the name, and then we take in an integer num1 and then an integer num2. So now something to realize about this is num1 and num2 are local to the scope of the add int method. So you can't use these variables external to this method. So if I try to say num1 plus num2, we get an error with the undefined, unresolved symbol, right? Because it's not in the scope of the no arguments function. okay, or the no arguments method. Okay, so we do some work on these integers. So say we just want to add them. So we can say integer result is equal to num1 plus num2. Okay, and then we need to, so we see this red squiggly line right here, right? So we're missing a return statement. So whenever we have a non-void return type, so in this case we're returning an integer, then we need to add a return statement of that same type. So we can just say return result, and then our error goes away, right? So this is very important to understand. Like void, you don't need a return statement, but in any other type of method that returns some object or some value, you need to have a return statement that matches that expected return type. Okay, so one more thing, I wanted to just clean up this code a little bit. We don't need to have an intermediate variable, and that's kind of what IntelliJ is telling me right here. So I could just basically say return num1 plus num2, and then I can just get rid of this line here. Okay, so that's just a simple function. All right. So what if we wanted to modify the like a field inside the class function? So say I created an integer, my second, or like height. Height is equal to 0, and integer width is equal to 0. And then I wanted to say create a method called public void set height. And then I pass in an integer height, and then I say this dot height is equal to height. So remember in the last, or a couple tutorials ago, or maybe the last tutorial where we talked about scope, is that since there's a name collision here, right? So the parameter to the function is an integer named height, but the class functions has another field named height. So this method only just wants to set the height of the class value, the class height, the field height, to a new value here, right? So if I want to ensure that I'm modifying the class's version of height, then I have to put a this dot height. Something else to note is the parameter names don't matter, right? So I could just name this parameter val, right? And then I can just say this dot height is equal to val, or then I can just remove this altogether, and this is fine, right? So now say I wanted to return the height of this new value, right? So if I say public integer get height, and it doesn't take any arguments, I just want to say return this dot height. So this is, you don't need to put a this here, right? But it's nice to be a little bit explicit, because you want to know, your class could potentially get really large, and we're like, okay, what height is this returning? So by putting a this in front of it, we know that we're referring to the field itself. Okay, so let's run this main method so that you can kind of see what it looks like to call a function on a class. Okay, so I'm going to call functions is equal to new functions. This is what we call instantiating a class. We'll go over this in the classes lecture. So if I want to say functions dot no arguments, it's going to try to call this method. So I say function, these are all instance methods here, right? So functions dot no arguments, you can call it on an instance of the functions class. So functions, this lowercase f functions, is an instance of the functions class. So we can call methods on that instance. Okay, so functions dot add int, and I'm going to say 4 and 6. Okay, and then I'm just going to actually print this out just to be a little bit more clear. All right, so this should print out 10. And then I'm going to actually call functions dot set height to 15, and then system dot out dot println functions dot get height. Okay, so this should actually print out 15 as well. Now, the next thing I want to show is if I create a second functions, if I create a second functions called functions1 is equal to new function, new functions, and then say I print out, so say I compare the two. So say I say system.out.println this line, and then I say yank and then I say functions1.getHeight. This is actually going to print out 0. So this is something I wanted to make very clear, is that when we modify a variable in a particular instance of that class, then it doesn't propagate to the other instance of that class unless the value is static. So I'm going to run this, and then I'll show you what this looks like. So I'm going to say run functions. Okay, so we see we got some output on the console. So we added a number and we returned it, and we got 10, which was expected. And then this first call said this method takes no arguments, which is that string that we wanted to print to the console. And then we set this height to 15, and we print that out, and we got 15. And then we get the height again of that same instance, we print 15, but then we get the height of the second instance, and it's 0, right? So that's something that's very important to recognize, is that variables in instance variables of a class are not shared unless we throw the static keyword. So if I say static integer height, and then I say set height to 15, this is now going to print out 15. So let's run this again. And we see that it's 15 for both classes. So that's very important to recognize, is that when we throw the static keyword in front of a field in a class, that means that is a class member, right? So that value is shared among all of the different instances of that class. So a use case of that, of using a static field, would be maybe I want to count and limit the number of instances of a particular class, right? So maybe I'm running a very resource intense application, and I only want to instantiate a certain amount of objects of a particular class. Then I can have a static counter variable that will increment every time an instance of that class is created. So that's a really quick overview of functions. Just know that there's the access modifiers that we talked about before. Static keyword can be thrown on a function, and then there's access modifiers, non-access modifiers, and then a return type, the name, and then arguments followed by some scoping. Okay, so if you have any questions, feel free to comment below. And if you like the video, please feel free to like and subscribe if you want to get more notifications on the next parts of the video. All right, thanks so much.